Hey everybody, welcome to ARE Live. I'm Mark Tier, the founder of Black Spectacles, and today we will be talking project management. So using a mock exam, we're going to cover several topics in this division of the ARE, and as a result of listening to this episode, you're going to learn some useful test-taking strategies that hopefully will help you feel comfortable demonstrating your knowledge of some of the principles you'll need to know for this exam. At our next ARE Live broadcast, we'll speak with a panel of architects who didn't take the traditional path to licensure. They will share their insights on what they would do different, knowing what they know now. Their stories will leave you feeling motivated to tackle licensure and put the ARE behind you. So that's going to be the next one. If you want to hop over to our podcast page, you can actually register for that now. Otherwise, we'll drop a link for that into the chat in GoToWebinar. As it relates to our products, you may have heard that Black Spectacles is the first ever NCARB approved test prep provider for all 6 of our ARE 5.0 divisions. And of course, that applies to all of our study materials, our video lectures, practice exams, flashcards. Interestingly, on September 25th, 2019 here, we're going to be launching another one of our group coaching cohorts. So if you're looking for some support and structure while studying, you can participate in that. I believe, again, the registration opens September 25th. It's actually for our October cohort. So you can go to blackspectacles.com/coaching to learn more about that. So I always like to tell people, if you'd like your boss to pay for your Black Spectacles membership, be sure to tell them about our firm licenses. And you can actually learn more about them on this Thursday, next Thursday, September 5th, at noon Central for our Black Spectacles ARE 5.0 product demonstration. And then during this webinar, one of our account executives, I think it's AJ, maybe Ty, will be walking you through why a firm subscription is a great way to help you get licensed. So again, we'll drop a link for that in the chat box as well. And lastly, today we have a special discount on Black Spectacles individual memberships, and we'll provide that coupon code at the end of the episode. One of the fun things about doing one of these mock exams is during this webinar, we'll be tracking all of your answers. Everyone who's already submitted your answers, if you got all of the questions correct, we're going to send you a free Black Spectacles t-shirt, so we'll talk about that at the end. Of course, my guest is Mike Newman. If you don't know Mike, he's a senior lecturer at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, as well as the founder of Shed Studio, and he is the instructor for our Black Spectacles online ARE exam prep lectures. So, of course, thank you for joining us today, Mike. And as always, today we'll be taking your questions using the GoToWebinar question box. And so with that, I will hand it over to you, Mike.
All right. So as Mark said, we're going to be talking about project management today. So project management and practice management have a lot of overlap. So when you're thinking about like the process of taking the exam, I'd really think about whether you want to kind of do them in quick sequence or roughly at the same time, because there's just so much of the information is going to be similar. The practice management, that one is really going to be all those issues that refer to the business as a whole. So you're going to be talking about how projects work, but the sort of angle you're taking that question from is how do we make it work as a business? So things like insurance, things like putting together a team for an RFP and things like that. Project management, the sort of assumption of each question is that there's a single project in front of you, and that, for this question, here's a scenario about a project, and it's just sort of testing your knowledge of the general flow of information and relationships in projects. So we're just going to jump right in. We got a few different questions to run through, just as a little test example here. And remember that some of these are written in sort of awkward ways so that I can have a certain topic to talk about. So if you miss one because it was sort of a little weirdly written, don't fret about it. That's just me trying to make sure I cover certain topics. So you can blame me about that. So let's jump right in. All right, our first one. One. You have been hired by the owner to help put together the program for a new mixed-use housing and retail project in a revitalizing neighborhood downtown. You should A. put together a detailed budget for the building using assembly method for cost estimating. B, analyze the relative space requirements for each of the different aspects of the project and how they might overlap. C, establish the general form of the building. D, the architect does not develop the program. So this is kind of an interesting question. One of the things you'll find is that many of the answers that you'll get on one of these questions are sort of correct to a degree. And the question is, which is the most correct? So there's a kind of a funny one in here, which is D, right? Which looks a little out of place. But I wouldn't be surprised if many of you actually answered D. And the reason that you might have answered D, the architect does not develop the program, is because in the actual AIA documents, in the contracts, in the B101 and its brethren, and the other A201 information, the architect is not expected to develop the program. In fact, the program is typically brought to the architect along with the survey, geotech information, some budget information, some other things like that, some environmental reports maybe. That's the thing that the owners, the clients, will hand to the architect in order for them to figure out what their fee is going to be, how they're going to do the project, how long things are going to take. It's hard to imagine putting together a fee if you don't have the program, if you don't know what the building is supposed to be. So the contracts actually specifically exclude the program from the work of the architect. There is, however, a spot where you can do it as an additional service. It's clearly located, and if the owner checks it off, then you are being paid to develop the program. So you can be in the situation, it's just not the typical where the architect is putting together the program. And the way the question is written, you have been hired by the owner to help put together the program, leads you to think either you're doing it as an additional service on a regular contract, or possibly even more likely, they've just given you a specific contract for doing the program. And the people who would do that are clients who just don't have the skill set, don't have a big infrastructure of development personnel who know how to put together a program, and so they might actually ask the architect to deal with it. So that's one of those funny ones, but it is not D. Let's keep going right up that list. How about C, establish the general form of the building? This one is actually a key one that I want to make sure you hear. It is absolutely not C. The reason for that is, and this is so hard for architects, myself included, to hear, but when you're putting together the program, the whole point is that you're doing research and analysis, and you're assembling data and information and goals and things like that. You are not designing. You are absolutely not designing. I can almost guarantee there will be some form of a question that leads you to think you should be designing in the program, and you're not designing when you're putting the program together. And the reason for that is if you're designing too early, if you start in where putting together like data information, and at the same time you're off on the side sketching what you think the building should look like, suddenly your data will start fitting to your designs. Subconsciously, maybe consciously, but the reason that you don't do it that way, the reason you don't want to start designing is because the data becomes suspect. You want the data to come through, and then once you've done that, the designs to come from that data. I'm using data a little loosely. Some of it's actual data, some of it's goals and other conversations with owners and things like that. So that's a big one. I just want to make sure everybody hears that you're not designing during programming. So then we have the first two that are the possibilities. A says, put together a detailed budget for building using assembly method for cost estimating. Putting together a budget for the building does make sense. It's not likely to be detailed. So that word bothers me, and I'm certainly not going to be using the assembly method of that. That's a thing where I'm getting into much more detail about, like, is it brick with an air cavity, or is it metal siding? Like, I'm getting into the design well before I would be ready to do it. So it's not A either. So therefore, we are B, analyze the relative space requirements for each of the different aspects of the project and how they might overlap. One of the big things you do, it's only one of many, but one of the big things you do when you're putting together a program is everybody, all the different departments, if it's a corporation, or all the different rooms, if it's a house or whatever it happens to be, you're sort of looking to say, like, everybody wants conference rooms and everybody wants, team spaces, and everybody wants a place for the copiers and all of that. Well, maybe you can make one conference room that works with 3 different departments or something, instead of having 3 separate conference rooms. One of the points of the program is to kind of find those pieces of information about those potential overlaps for the program. So B is the answer.
235 left.
Well done.
You didn't knock out as many as you hit on this, so good job.
Yeah, well done. Okay, 2. Which of the following are aspects of review for the zoning code analysis? We have FAR, covenants, setbacks, easements, meets and bounds, and parking. All right, so I'm just going to go through and show the answers right off the bat, and then we're just going to talk about each one a little bit, just to kind of run through it. So the potential, the correct answers here are A, FAR, that's part of zoning. C, the setbacks, and I'll talk more in a second about what that is. And then F, the parking. Again, this is one of those examples where all of the answers are reasonable answers in one way or another. When you're doing a zoning code analysis, I would actually be interested in the covenants. I would be interested in the easements. Those are things that are similar to the zoning code, but they are not the zoning code. They are separate legal documents that are private legal entities that are not part of the zoning. So again, there's many possible answers, and you're looking for the ones that are the best answer. So since this is about the zoning code, these 3 are the ones that are absolutely part of the zoning code. FAR is the floor area ratio, and that's essentially a way of saying how big a building can be on a site. And it's a direct ratio between the square footage of the site versus the allowed square footage of the building that's going to be put on that site. So if you have a 10,000 square foot site and you have an FAR of 1, that means you could build a 10,000 square foot building. It might be 2 stories, it might be 3 stories, whatever. The whole thing is going to add up to the 10,000. If you had a FAR of 12, well, then you potentially can build a quite tall building. If you have an FAR of 0.4 or something like that, that's probably in a single family residence area, something along those lines. So it's just a way of controlling massing in given districts. Setbacks are obviously front setbacks, side setbacks. That's the area that you're not allowed next to the property line to build. In a commercial district, your setback, for example, on the front is probably 0. So just the fact that we talk about them as setbacks doesn't actually mean there's always an actual dimension. Sometimes it's 0, sometimes it's 10 feet, sometimes it's 20 feet, depends on the situation. And parking is one of those things that is a huge part of the zoning code analysis. I have been part of many projects that started, and then we did the analysis, and then we realized, they can't afford to put in all the parking that is going to be required for this, and the project stops. It's probably as important as any other part of the zoning code analysis. Now, that may change over the years as we go into different kinds of car ownership setups and self-driving cars and things like that. But the exam is not there yet, and so parking is a huge part of these things. Let's talk about covenants for just a second. So covenants can be on many different types of developments, but the easiest way to picture them is like a housing development. And if you've ever gone to like a gated community or any sort of housing development where you drive through and you're like, wow, all the houses kind of look the same. all the roofs are same roof angles or something like that. That's because there's a bunch of covenants on that set of properties. And the idea is to make sure that everything's sort of consistent and that nobody builds anything that's going to lower the property value of somebody else. And if you're in Aspen and you're driving through a development and everything looks kind of Swiss chalet-like, well, that's because there's a bunch of covenants on the land. And so they are legal documents that ride with the deed. And so when you buy into that, you are buying into not only the piece of land, but the covenants, the rules by which you are allowed to build on that land. It could be materials, it could be location, it could be the fact there was actually a big court case a little while ago with somebody who was trying to, for sustainability reasons, got rid of her dryer because she thought it was a big waste of energy. And so she was hanging her clothes out on a clothesline, and she got sued because the covenant said you weren't allowed to do that. Right? So it's both architectural and other issues, like you can't put a truck in your driveway, things along those lines. So it's a pretty big grouping of things, but it's very important. You obviously wouldn't want to design a house without looking through the covenants if there were covenants on that site. If you're just doing a one-off building in a one-off location where there's no big developer involved, then covenants are not going to be involved. But in any sort of big development, you will definitely find them. Easements. Easements are an interesting one because they're very similar to zoning setbacks, and so it's often confused with setbacks. You'll have often, for example, a utility easement for electric line or something along those lines. But you can also have, let's say you have a piece of property that, by the way that the property around it got sold off, doesn't have access to a roadway. And so to get a driveway in, you need to have an easement through somebody else's property. So it's that you get the right to put your driveway through and to use the driveway, but it's still actually owned by the other people, by the other piece of property. You can have view easements. You can have all sorts of different drainage easements. So water that's draining from one site can drain through and across another site. You could have easements with livestock. You can have all kinds of different forms of easements. But the big ones that show up a lot for architects are utility easements, driveway easements, and such. So they are a legal document that rides with the deed. So if I own the land, I can't sell you this easement right. You put in a driveway, and then I quickly turn around and sell my property, and the next person buys the property and says, no, you can't put your driveway there. That's not plausible, because when I sold the property, the deed included the easement of that for that driveway. So easements are very similar to zoning code. They are pieces of information about the site that tell you where you can and cannot build, but they are separate legal documents that are essentially contracts between two different landowners, or two different entities, a landowner and a different entity. Meets and bounds is kind of an interesting one. That's a type of survey. It's sort of an old-fashioned type of survey that you have distances and angles, and you kind of put it all together. And there are times these days when you still would use a meets and bounds, but it's kind of a referencing to an old-fashioned survey system. So FAR, setbacks, and parking. All right, number 3. During a weekly walkthrough of the construction site, the architect sees that the painters are using the wrong color in the master bedroom. The architect should, A, write a letter to the owner, B, tell the painter to stop, C, inform the GC that there is a discrepancy, D, write a change order to correct the problem. So again, there's a couple in here that may be correct answers if you had more information. For example, D, if we had more of the timeline and we knew more about what was going on, it is quite possible that either you or the GC, as the architect, you or the GC, would create a change order. But we don't have enough information yet, and we don't even know whether we actually do need to do the change order. So it's not D. How about write a letter to the owner? Well, I mean, that's certainly an okay answer. That's a solid answer. It's not the best answer, though. And the reason it's not the best answer is that there's actually action happening on the site, and things are going forward. And like a written letter to the owner, who knows how long that would take to sort of play out. And so it's just not a really good answer. So I'm going to call that wrong, even though it's kind of correct. How about B? Tell the painter to stop. In almost, unless the contract is for design build, or you have a specific contract where the architect is being consciously given control over means and methods, and therefore also being compensated for having that control over means and methods, you never ever walk onto a job site and say stop to any of the subs of the general contractor. If they're your subs, feel free to say stop. That's one of your jobs, is to control the flow of information and the work that's happening. But if they are not your subs, it is not your job. And interestingly, by telling them to stop in that situation, you could potentially take on a great deal of potential liability down the road. If, for example, the building comes in, 4 weeks late, and there are penalties for the general contractor for each week that they're late, they are very likely to write a letter that says, well, the architect came through 7 weeks ago or 12 weeks ago and told the painters to stop, and therefore took over control of the schedule. So from a legal standpoint, the danger of saying stop to the painters is that you are literally absorbing the schedule responsibility by doing that. Now, it can be a little complicated. It depends on if it was being handled through litigation or something, if problems went into a deep situation like that. It's not necessarily true that every judge would follow that kind of thinking, but it's true enough that that's how the contracts are written, and that's how the sort of expectation of conduct. The painters are part of the GC's world. The mechanical engineer and the structural engineer and those folks are part of the architect's world. They don't tell the structural engineer to stop, and you don't tell the painter or the plumber or the electrician to stop. However, you do inform the GC that there is a discrepancy. And there's another reason for this, and that I just want to make sure, because you can imagine a slightly more complicated question that could lead you to a couple of different ways of thinking about this. One of the reasons why C is so accurate, especially in something like the paint color in a master bedroom, and I always use this example because this actually happened to me, where I chose a color, and the client was like, "Oh yeah, that's great, Mike. Thanks very much. Love the color," and then clearly turned around and said to the general contractor, "Whatever you do, don't put that, buttercup yellow or whatever the heck it was, into the master bedroom. Use this robin egg blue instead." And they're the owner. They get to say that. That's fine. So when I go onto the job site and I say, "Hey, this is the wrong paint color," it may be that the GC actually has newer or more useful information. Or it may be that the only way to get that color is to put on a certain coat first and then a second coat later that's a different color to give you the full spectrum, or you just don't necessarily know. That's one of the reasons why you don't just say stop, because the painters, if you say stop, the painters are going to stop and go off the job site and go to another project of theirs, and maybe you can't get them back for 2 weeks, right? So you can, just by saying stop, you can actually really mess up a schedule, because of course other people can't do what they need to do until the painters have finished. So the whole point here, and this is one of those things that you're going to find over and over again on questions from NCARB, is that you're following the sort of logical set of relationships. You're following the contracts, and you're following the regular connections. So there's a problem on the job site, you talk to the GC, you have a conversation about it. If it turns out there's more information, then great. If it doesn't, and they truly are painting the wrong color, then you might get into a situation where you say, well, wait, this isn't going to meet the requirements of the contract documents. Once this project is finished, paint color will be the wrong color, so we need to stop this process. And then you're saying that to the GC. The GC has their response. So you're having it as a discussion with everybody representing their agendas and their appropriate contractual responsibilities. The only reason that a change order would get written is if you had spec'd one thing and they had painted that, and then it turned out everybody wanted to change it and we had to go to something different, and it cost more or cost less or was going to take longer, and so therefore the contract between the owner and the GC needed to be changed. And we just don't have enough information here to think that that might be the case. So inform the GC that there is a discrepancy. It's almost always these questions are going to be about having a reasonable conversation with the appropriate other players.
All right, down to 83 here.
Wow. All right, here we go. It's getting exciting. Okay, number 4, the client is ready to go and signs the B101 owner-architect agreement. One of the first tasks that the architect should do is a building code search and analysis. What is the first aspect of this process that should be established? Permitted uses, construction type, occupancy, egress. So first thing right off the bat, I'm going to cancel out A because that's not the building code, that's the zoning code. So permitted uses are part of the zoning process. One quick aside before I move on. One of the things to remember is most of these terms are national terms and get used across the board everywhere. Every once in a while you'll find zoning code will not use the specific term permitted uses, but the vast majority do, to the point that NCARB will actually use that term. The other one that I used earlier, FAR, floor area ratio, for example, in Chicago, it's actually, actually FAR they use in Chicago, but some places use subtly different ones, but the exam uses FAR. So the ones that we talk about here are all things that are likely to be used on the exam. So A, permitted uses, nope, that's zoning. This is talking about the building code search and analysis, so not A. So the question really becomes construction type, occupancy, or egress. Excuse me. Well, egress is an important thing to understand and is going to have a very quick and powerful impact on design thinking, but you can't really have a conversation about egress until you know the construction type and the occupancy. It doesn't really make any sense to even start the conversation about egress. For example, let's say we're doing a hospital, and the hospital, if you figured out what the egress pattern was, and then you figured out that, okay, we're going to do it out of wood 2x4 construction. Like, really, you're going to do a hospital out of 2x4 construction? That doesn't really make any sense to the occupancy type, and it's going to be very difficult. So you'd be able to do it, but it would be a very, very, very small amount of building that they would allow you to build. And then you say, well, okay, maybe we'll do it out of concrete. Well, now you could probably build as big a hospital as you wanted, right? So the egress patterns will change dramatically given the construction type and the occupancy. So unfortunately, not egress. That'll come, and it's important, it'll come soon, but the first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at occupancy. It's sort of obvious. It's so obvious that probably a few people missed it because it just seems like it's sort of construction type would be the logical place that you would go. But you can't really have a conversation about construction type until you have nailed down occupancy. Now, the example of hospital is a pretty easy one. There will be a hospital construction type, occupancy type. So not all of them will be that simple. For example, let's say you have retail on the first floor and multifamily above, right? That's a mixed occupancy, and it can be sort of complicated about how you start to analyze the occupancy of that building and finding the situations where there's conflicts. You're always having to go with the more restrictive aspect of the conflict. So understanding the occupancy is by far the most important thing to get done first. Then the second thing you're going to do is you're going to make your best guess as to what sort of construction type. And the two pieces of information, occupancy and construction type, will then allow you to sort of search and find what sort of fire-rated walls are you going to need, what kind of egress are you going to need, what sort of, how big a building are you going to be allowed to build, how big a floor can you build. All of that information is going to flow from the building code by being able to use the occupancy with the construction type. So we start with occupancy and then go to construction type.
All right, down to 25.
Number 5, which of the following actions would be the most useful for the architect to do following completion of the design development set? So this is, I find these kinds of questions a little annoying, but I wanted to put one in here because they're trying to test your knowledge, but they're also trying to make a point, right? And so you will get questions like this that are sort of trying to encourage you to have good meetings with your consultant teams, meetings at regular intervals with the client, meetings during the construction phase, and regular intervals with the contractors. So it's all about kind of systematizing and making things make sense. But it's also about starting with a really good program, starting with a reasonable budget, starting with all that, a well-informed starting point and with a good, solid team. And then always going back and checking against all of that information as you move along. Because you don't want what's referred to in a lovely way as creep. You don't want to just suddenly the building is 20% bigger because it just worked better, and now the building is obviously also 20% more expensive. And if you haven't told the client that you made the building bigger, well, then there's going to be a problem down the road, right? So NCARB is all about kind of systematizing all of that sort of process. So let's run through these. So just a reminder, which of the following actions would be the most useful for the architect to do following the completion of the design development set? So schematic design, potentially pre-design issues, then schematic design, then design development, then contract documents, so permits and construction sets, then bidding, then construction administration. So we're still in the design portion. We're not into the contract document set yet, but we are well through. We actually should have, by the end of design development, we should have a building that everybody knows what it is, what it looks like, what the materials are, all of that. But we just haven't done all the detailing yet. So A, review the current project against the initial budget projections. Absolutely. It's very easy to have creep on these things and things to get out of hand. And so at the end of schematic design, you're going to review the project compared to the original budget projections. When you get to the end of design development, you're going to review the project against the original budget projections. When you get to the end of the CD sets, the contract documents, you're actually not going to review. I mean, if you're smart, you will in-house, but you're not required to review because that's what the bidding is for. You're going to get the bidding is going to go through and do this. So the idea is you start with real information and then you always go back and make sure that you're still meeting that information. Let's look at B. Develop the bid forms to produce the most accurate and useful bidding possible. That is absolutely true at some point, but not yet. You can't be putting together the bid forms at the design development stage. It just doesn't, you're not there yet. You have to wait until you have more information, you know more about what's going on, you've had conversations with the owner, which you probably really can't have until the end of design development about, well, what happens if the building comes in too expensive? Are there things we don't have to include? Are there things, are there things on the wish list versus things that must be in there? So B is a great thing to do, but it would be happening during the bid phase or at the very end of the CD phase. So not B. C, set up a meeting with there's a little wrong here. Let's get rid of that. With the team of consultants to review progress and coordinate overlapping issues of structure and MEP. Absolutely. This is totally the whole point of what I was just talking about in terms of setting up at the end of schematic design. All the consultants that are already part of the team should take a look and have a conversation. What do they foresee the problems are going to be? At the end of design development, everybody has their game plans going, and now we can see how things are going to be interacting and whether there's going to be a problem with, the size of a truss versus the size of a duct, and all of those kinds of things. And so this is the perfect moment to have that conversation before everybody gets into their full-on contract document setup. So now we have one more out of the last three. D, analyze whether current design is still in alignment with the original code review. Doesn't that sound an awful lot like A? Yes, it does. What a good idea. So D is absolutely a good one. Let's look at E, initiate the review of the means and methods for the construction. Unless it says that you are actually doing the construction end of things, that this is a design build project, the assumption is that it is not design build, and therefore means and methods means the way that things are going to be built and the schedule by which they will be built. That's the GC, unless the question specifically takes you down the road of being a design builder where you're actually responsible. The architect is actually responsible for the construction, but it's very, you might get a question or two like that, but very unlikely. Anytime you see means and methods, that's sort of the old-timey way of saying, how are we going to actually build this thing? The architect has put together the intent, the design intent, which is all your drawings and all of that information in the spec book and all of that. That's all the intent of what things should be, and then the contractor brings the means and methods and the schedule to actually make it happen. So absolutely not for the architect to be doing the means and methods, like I said, unless you've been specifically contracted to do it. And then F, order the survey to determine the site design viability. If you have done the design development and you haven't looked at a survey yet, you are sunk, man. That's a very bad time to get your survey because you're basing, the whole design off where it can fit on the site, and that's something you actually have to start. So F is wrong for lots of reasons. One is it's too late for that. I mean, I've actually had projects where we didn't get the survey until this point, but that doesn't mean it's a good thing to copy. So one is the timing is just wrong, but the other is you're not, as the architect, you are not ordering the survey. The owner is ordering the survey. Now, again, if the question includes that it's being taken from the developer's standpoint, POV, or if the architect is acting as a developer or something along those lines, then you might be ordering the survey. But there's a reason that the owner orders the survey. The survey is about the site. It's about it's a legal description of what the owner has that you are going to be putting your design intent onto. And so they are giving you that legal description. They are telling you about the soils that are there. That's part of that sort of telling you about the site. They are telling you, they being the owner, are telling you what the program is, what they need. They are giving you the information about environmental issues. So if they've done an environmental report, a phase 1 or phase 2, something like that, they are giving you that information. So they're also giving you the funding information and all the things about what are going to be the drivers of the design that you will then take and turn into a design intent. So if you order the survey, what that means is you are now taking responsibility for the legal information there. And if there's a mistake on the survey, instead of it being a problem of the owners, it's now a problem of yours. Even if the owner says, hey, could you just order that for me? You have now taken responsibility for it. So you absolutely never want to order the survey. I say that having ordered surveys probably, 15 times in my career, so at least, because you do what you got to do to get things done, but that's not the same as doing it right? This is an exam about doing it right, and so when you see something like this, unless the question specifically gives you an out, like you are acting as the developer while you're doing this, unless it says something like that, you never order the survey. That's part of the owner's responsibility. GC's responsibility, means and methods and schedules. Your responsibility is design intent and compliance with program, compliance with code, compliance with budget, and all of those issues. So there you go, A, C, and D.
Mike, we do have one. So,
Yeah.
Number one, holy smokes, we have 20 winners.
Wow,
So,
awesome.
Can we make the questions harder next time, please?
Yeah,
I'm just kidding.
says the guy who has to.
Yeah. No, I'm just kidding, actually. We do have one question from Dhruva going back to question 4. So if you can maybe skip back one. Question was, if the client's ready to sign the contract, isn't occupancy already discussed before?
Well, don't get confused by using the term occupancy, and that's great. I meant to say this, so thank you for asking this particular question. When we're talking about the building code, that's a very specific version of the word occupancy. Now, obviously, the program is going to say, hey, we want to do a multifamily, or we want to do a hospital, or we want to do a corporate headquarters, or whatever it is, or a warehouse or something. So you're talking about how the building will be used, which is the colloquial version of occupancy. And that's one thing that you're going to use to figure out what occupancy means in terms of the building code. So, for example, let's say you're doing a theater. Well, what's your occupancy? Well, it's an assembly, but is it just assembly, or is it assembly 1? And different places will have slightly different versions of this, but like assembly for 40 people or 45 people is a very different set of rules in terms of egress and fire rating and things than assembly for a situation where you're going to have 3,000 or 4,000 people. So when we say occupancy in the context of the building code, we're not talking about the sort of general use of the word like, hey, what are you going to do in this building? We're talking about specifically a list that's in the code, and you're grabbing specific pieces of information and you're choosing the exact way, and that by choosing those specific elements, it's now taking you to a different part of the table of how big a room can it be, how does it need to be 1 hour rated walls, or can it be 2 hour rated walls, or should it be 4 hour rated walls? Like the tables, you can only read the tables by knowing that slice of the occupancy.
All right, beautiful. Thank you, Mike. Thank you for our conversation today. Thanks everybody for tuning in. At the next ARE Live podcast that we have, we'll be speaking with a panel of architects about the reasons to get the ARE out of the way sooner rather than later. I just posted the link to register in the chat box in your GoToWebinar control panel. Of course, you can also just go to blackspectacles.com/podcast to register and sign up.
I love this topic because this is one of those things. People come up and talk to me all the time about, oh, I don't really feel like I need to worry about it right now, so I'll just deal with it. Like, that's fine in certain situations, that's great, but it's never easier to do later. It just isn't.
Yeah. In fact, we have quite a few people in our coaching program who are living that reality right now.
You get farther away from taking exams. You get, it's just going to be harder to do 10 years from now. Trust me, it's harder to do than 2 years from now.
Yeah. Cool. So I guess, Mike, we'll have to make sure you tune in. And
Yeah, I'll have to listen
this
in.
one. So for folks, so if you'd like to learn more about our ARE exam prep curriculum, you can go to blackspectacles.com, where you can try out any of our course videos. And as I always like to say, if you'd like your boss to pay for your membership, be sure to visit blackspectacles.com/firms to learn more about our firm memberships for firms of any size. And then for those of you who are ready to start preparing for the ARE right now, you can use coupon code PJM82719YT to get a 15% discount for the entire duration of your ARE exam prep membership. And then finally, tomorrow we'll email you a follow-up about today's live broadcast. So please let us know what you think and share any suggestions that you may have, including ideas for new topics. If there's something you'd like to us to do a topic on, please respond to that email and let us know because we really do read everything that you say and use that to tune our next episodes. So thanks for tuning in.